Okay, so I'm going to be talking about education as a science. It's without a doubt true that people need education overall in the population. That, in other words, there's no possibility of saying things that are right that people already are going to know to agree with. You can know what's right, and that doesn't mean that telling it to people means they're going to agree with you. I think we've probably already experienced that a number of times. But it makes something very important of a point about the difference between the way people currently think and then how you change how somebody thinks. What a process of discovery is, and doing that in science, doing that in music, is very similar to the way Socrates does that with the people he's talking to help them realize that they have something that they need to learn from him, or that they need to learn in general, because what they thought they knew, they didn't. So, I'm just reflecting on a few funny things about the economy that I heard over the past couple of days. People really complaining about immigration. Apparently that's like the thing that people are really upset about right now. That's what they, whatever news they watch has decided to make them angry about. The idea that people are coming and stealing all of our jobs or something like that. I heard people who were saying that Obama is trying to win votes by giving things away, by giving out Obama phones like they're candy, by giving out food stamps, that more and more people are getting on food stamps, and that shows that Obama is trying to pay them off to get their votes. I think obviously more people are on food stamps because they don't have any money, and now they apply and they're accepted into the program. Not because the program is being expanded to get votes, but kind of stupid ideas. And then the main thing is, of course, how do you create economic growth? A lot of people think that it's got to be free market. It's not true. What's missing in all of this is just a basic understanding of what an economy is, what the human species is, how we're different from animals. The very basics of things. So I wanted to say a few things about Mr. LaRouche's economics textbook. He wrote a textbook. Actually, he wrote two, I suppose. I never read his first one. But this one first came out in '84. It's called So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. Very hopeful title. Presumably people reading it would like to know about it. Now in this book, one of the first things that Lynn points out, that Mr. LaRouche points out, is that economics really isn't treated as a science by most people who think they're economists. Most of the writing about economics, it's political writing. I mean, if you think about pretty much any field of study, people who weigh in on it, are they doing it because they're totally independent and they're just studying it as academics, as some sort of professor or something who's just supposed to study knowledge to get knowledge for knowledge's sake? That very, very rarely happens because people aren't like that. People have thoughts, people have things that they want to see happen, and that is definitely true in economics because it's incredibly important for politics and how people live. So one of the first things that Lynn makes a point of in the preface of the book is, compare, let's look at like two groups of economists. Look at Benjamin Franklin. So he wrote about the use of paper money for the new United States, well, even before the United States was created. He had thoughts about that. He had thoughts about increasing manufactures. His work helped make Manchester one of the sites of industrialization in England, so that people later thought that England started the Industrial Revolution. It was not true. It was, well, some things happened there, but it's because of Ben Franklin, not because of the British. So Ben Franklin, Gottfried Leibniz, who we're going to talk about in a short moment, Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton fought in the Revolutionary War. Right? He was Washington's top aide. List, Carey, people who worked with President Lincoln. So obviously these people, these economists, they're not, none of these guys worked in a university. These people were all actively engaged in trying to improve mankind overall. Compare that with the people that if you ever had the misfortune of taking an economics class, you probably hear about in school, or if you think about economic theory. People like Adam Smith. Adam Smith worked for the British East India Company. He wasn't an academic. He was working for a major imperial power in the world, developing techniques to increase their control and how to destroy the United States. The book, The Wealth of Nations, should have been called The Poverty of the United States. That was the intention in writing it. That book came out at the same time as our revolution. Right? Or if you look at other Brits, most of these terrible economists are British. Some of them are French. But people like Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham said that, well, first off, he wrote an article on why pederasty was an okay idea. He also wrote a book about why usury was perfectly acceptable. He even wrote an article about why suicide was a good idea. Jeremy Bentham said if you are a burden to society, then your last act of goodness as a person should be to kill yourself, because you're just using resources that other people could have. Now, somebody who says that, does anybody think that maybe he also believes that he should get to choose who should be suicided? Because he's saying it's possible to figure out that you're better off dead. I think he's not going to apply that only to himself, but he's going to be very happy to apply that to other people and say, well, they should have realized that they should have committed suicide. Maybe they weren't smart enough or as enlightened as I am to tell them that, but really they ought to be dead because they're a burden. So Jeremy Bentham's considered an economist. So if you compare the good economists who were right about things, they were trying to improve mankind. The economists that you learn about in school were trying to destroy the human race, trying to destroy the creative potential of the human race and perpetuate the control of empire. So you pay money, if you'll say you're a victim of consumer fraud. You go to a university, you give them money, you want to learn things, it's good, you want to learn about the world, you pay money, and you hear in economics that basically knowledge is irrelevant. That there's an idea of the invisible hand. Well, first off, a lot of the economic stuff is just kind of silly. But one of the big ideas behind it is that it's impossible to know what would actually improve the economy. They say, Adam Smith said that this is how God created the universe. He said, God made man, God made our natures in such a way that by every person pursuing their own individual pleasures and avoiding pains, like the pain you would experience if you took on the empire, as long as you don't do that and you pursue your own pleasures, God will make the world a better place. God's so good, you don't have to think about how to improve things. Just be selfish, and God will take care of the rest. Sounds like a Jehovah's Witness. But that's actually Adam Smith. So he came around before the Jehovah's Witnesses did. So that idea says that if you try to think about the economy, you screw it up. That's the idea behind the free market. That as long as we don't try to make anything happen, we'll get the best outcome. If you try to plan things, something bad will happen. Like I talked to a guy the other day, I was mentioning Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, Franklin Roosevelt, ooh, I don't like him. I said, why don't you like him? He said, he had a big government. I said, was big, small, is that your only measure? Did he have a good government? I said, well, I don't care about that, it was big. That's the sort of non-thinking that you get from this outlook of the British liberals, they were called. Not liberal like the word gets used today on Fox News about people who are oppressing conservatives, but British liberals who said that philosophically there's no such thing as an ethical concept. That all we are is a combination of what we sense, what we perceive, what we want, what we don't want, the things that give us pleasure, the things that give us pain. And they also believe that you're not allowed to decide what gives you pleasure. Joan of Arc decided that she would save France. Now, how much pleasure was that worth? It seems that that's kind of a weird question. You wouldn't say, how many ice cream cones worth of pleasure was that worth to her? Benjamin Franklin, creating a nation, how many dollars is that worth to him? Can we quantify how happy that made him? It's pretty stupid stuff. Living for a mission, having an objective with your life, that just doesn't even fit into their framework. So they say no one should really live like that anyway. You should be living for basic pleasures, but they'll tell you what kind of pleasures you ought to be having. So it's not just bad enough that they say pleasure is all that matters, they're going to tell you which ones are acceptable. Anyway, so just this basic difference. There are people who want to improve the world, and they think about economics from the standpoint of understanding how to better improve our ability to discover new things and implement them and put in place the best technologies and the best ideas and the best kinds of production and agriculture to help people live better. And there are people who their job is political control, and then they write economic theories, not as economists, but as PR people. You get PR people who try to spin a situation a certain way. That's what Adam Smith was. It's just propaganda. It's not economics. So I wanted to say a few things about this fellow, because I've been looking into him recently. Gottfried Leibniz. Everybody wore wigs like that back then. So he lived from 1646 to 1716, and he was, LaRouche calls him the founder of economic science. Now, he was just an amazing person. He did just about everything you can imagine doing in your life. I don't know if he set any records for running a mile or anything like that, but the things that he took up included reunifying the churches. And I think Daniel gave a class here recently about how Nicholas of Cusa was trying to reunite the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox faiths. Well, by Leibniz's time, the Catholic Church had split up, and you have Protestants. He was trying to bring that together for political reasons. That there was some way to work out the differences, that it was not necessary to have the potential for ongoing religious war in Europe. That was a major effort of his through his life. The emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, brought him to Vienna to work on this. He developed the calculus, not out of the intention of torturing people in school, but to solve physical problems. Leibniz knew that material things, by sensible thing, I mean things that you can sense, aren't the foundation of reality. That forces, powers, causes, he would use the word conatus, these are the sort of things that were real. For example, we'll talk about it in a second, well, in his studies of physics and dynamics, he proved a major error that Descartes had made about how moving bodies interact with each other. He said when people look at moving bodies in terms of perceptual things, like their speeds or their sizes, Descartes did that. He came up with a bunch of formulas about how bodies bump into each other and move. They're all wrong. Every single one of Descartes' formulas for moving bodies is wrong, except for one. He said if two things of the same size move at the same speed and bump into each other, they'll both bounce off at the same speed. Other than that, everything Descartes said was wrong. Leibniz gave a better approach to it by discovering that there's something about the motion of bodies that isn't anything that you see. It's measured by taking their speed and squaring it. Now, I don't want to get too much into this, but if you have a length and you square a length, you can take a foot and you can make a square out of it. You get an area. That means something you can think about and look at and see. It's not such a strange idea. If you take speed, you can double the speed, right? You could double 30 miles an hour, you could go 60. If you have a speed and you square it, what does that look like? What does that mean?
Doesn't mean nothing.
Exactly. There's no intuitive meaning behind that at all. Leibniz showed that this thing that doesn't have any intuitive meaning to the senses is actually the way to measure the power in bodies, which Descartes never would have figured out if he just looked at things. So he set off the whole beginnings of real physics. He also began economics. He worked on projects like new ways of pumping water out of mines. He worked on projects for increasing manufacturing. He worked on programs for transportation. So anyway, this is the kind of person who works on economics from the standpoint of doing things in the world compared to, say, Adam Smith. Okay, so let's go through some basic concepts here from Mr. LaRouche's textbook, and then we're going to talk about physical chemistry at the end. The way that LaRouche opens the book is by talking about a couple of very important measures for the economy. If you try to measure the economy as a whole today, it's very difficult because the measures that you get are things like GNP or GDP, gross domestic product, gross national product. You get numbers that are made by adding up all the profit in the economy. You add it all up, you get a number, you say that's what the whole economy does because I added everything up. LaRouche's view has always been, forget it. That's not the way you measure an economy. Measuring what's there, what you see, isn't it. What can the economy do? What can the people who are the actors in the economy, what can we do? So the first concept that he brings in is energy flux density. If you're familiar with LaRouche, you've probably heard this term before. Energy flux density is a way of measuring, well, I guess its name sort of says it, the density of the flow of energy. That's what energy flux density is. So you could measure, for example, per person, how much energy are we using? That's a great measure. It's very indicative about, we're gonna see that a few slides ahead. That's a great measure of how strong an economy is. Worldwide, if you look at economies where people use more electricity, those are stronger economies. Because obviously you can't have a developed nation if no one has access to electricity. It's sort of an obvious point. The other question about it is, how dense is that energy? There are potentials to use a whole lot of energy and still not accomplish things that you can do with much less energy the right way. Simple example, a knife. Or how about a can opener? If you have a can and you don't have a can opener or a sharp piece of metal, you're gonna have a hell of a time getting that can open. It's probably gonna take a lot of energy. You know, you're gonna be banging it with a hammer or a rock or something. By the time you get it open, you're probably gonna have your soup all over the floor. It's not gonna work very well. And it's gonna take a lot more effort than if you have a can opener, where the energy is concentrated. A knife is a much easier way to cut something than, you know, trying to rip it apart with your hands or something like that. Or a dull knife. Or if you think about what can be done with a laser. You know, machine tools that use lasers to cut the metal actually use less energy than machine tools that use drill bits. They're more effective. They actually use less energy, even though the kind of energy is more intense. The density of energy in a laser is beyond a drill, but it takes less of it when you've got that higher power. The second big measure that Lind and LaRouche introduces is potential relative population density. So population density, how many people in a certain area. Potential population density, that's a great question. How do you figure out what's the potential number of people that could be supported? How many people could live on the earth? Untold amounts. Some people will say 5 billion, we're already past it. The Queen of England says 1 or 2 billion, we're way past it. So she'd be happy to kill off most of the world's population. But how do you determine what that potential is? For animals, you can just observe them. You know, you could say, maybe you could say we took out all the predators. We got a protected area here. It's fenced off, and we've introduced some deer. And we're just going to see how many of them there are before they run out of leaves to eat or plants to munch on or whatever. For people, the number of people that can be supported is determined by people. We change that. Unlike any other species, we change the number of people that can live on the earth. How about the development of agriculture? That sure changed the number of people that could live in a certain area. How about a sensible form of medicine? That sure changes the number of people that can live. How about water treatment systems? How about the steam engine? The ability to have power that isn't from muscles or from the wind or water mills. With steam power, with coal-powered steam engines, we've got an incredible mechanical force. Of course that's going to change how many people we need support now. You don't have to do as much work to produce what you need for your economy. So that is the heart of economic value. Lind and LaRouche says that the rate of increase of potential relative population density, that is the best measure of what's valuable in an economy. So you ask, is something valuable? What's the value of X, Y, or Z? Today, an economist will say, put it on eBay. What did it sell for? That was its value, because that's how much somebody else wanted to pay for it. Now, I know we've all bought things that we regret. We've all wasted money on something. You may have got some exercise equipment you never use. You got you bought some shoes and you discovered that they're totally uncomfortable. You can't wear them. You bought some food and it was nasty. We've all spent money on things that were bad. How much people are willing to pay for something doesn't really tell you how valuable it is. People are willing to pay for crap. Does that mean it's good for them? I don't think so. So instead of looking at how much will somebody else pay for something, say how valuable is it at increasing the potential relative population density? Is it necessary for people having a decent, healthy standard of living to be able to pursue science and politics and change the way we work as a society to improve it? Is whatever we're talking about something that's crucial for the discovery process? What's the value of a screw, for example? You know, they sell them at the hardware store. Maybe you're going to use it for something that's not very helpful, like you're going to be using it for just some stupid business that's useless. Maybe it's going to be bought by somebody who is making a physics demonstration for their classroom to make sure that the kids in the class really know things instead of just reading a formula in a book. Maybe that screw, maybe 1,000 of them were ordered by NASA in the 60s, or a contractor of NASA in the 60s to go to the moon. They all maybe paid the same amount for that screw, but the value of it was obviously different. The value of it for increasing the potential relevant population density. So you can think about that as things in your life too. There are things in your life that might make you feel good for a short period of time. And then think about what's valuable to you as a person. Are these things, or are these habits, or these outlooks that you've got, are they helpful in helping you increase this, be a force for improving humanity? That's the way to measure value for yourself too. So, in chapter 3, LaRouche talks about thermodynamics. And he opens up with a really good quote, which I'll paraphrase, which is that, he makes a joke. He says that the laws of thermodynamics are legislative laws, not scientific ones. The laws of thermodynamics, the first two laws of thermodynamics, law number 1 says that the amount of energy in the universe is constant. You can change the form of the energy, but you can't create it and it won't disappear. So for example, you'll never make a motor that's more than 100% efficient. No one's ever going to discover a motor that's able to turn the things in a factory more than the total amount of electricity that they bought that was supplied. 100% efficient, maximum. And the total amount of energy is fixed. That's it. Second law is that everything gets worse. Specifically, it says that entropy always increases, that energy always becomes less ordered, that it's not possible to have 100%. The first law says you can't have more than 100% efficiency. The second one says you can't even get 100%. You'll never make a car engine that takes all of that power that was in the gasoline explosion and turns it all into motion. Forget it. You're going to get heat coming out of the radiator, you're going to have noise, exhaust, etc. So putting those two things together, those laws of thermodynamics say that the universe is always getting worse. Energy is always dissipating, we're losing it, we're using up our resources. Even if it seems like we're concentrating and making things more ordered, like obviously, this wasn't just, sitting in the ground. This was, the metal was produced from rocks, it was melted, it was bent into this shape, it was put together. But the energy involved to do that is lost and we'll never get it back. So say these laws of thermodynamics. It's not true, and I'll say why. The value of energy, or of any of these things, you can't just look at it from the non-living context. A chemist might say energy is energy. Just like the guy at the hardware store might say, I don't care who buys this bulb. Whoever wants to buy it, they're 70 cents each. They're all equal. When we discover new things, we change the value of all these things. Just give one example. When the laws of thermodynamics were passed in the late 1800s, nobody knew about nuclear science. So as soon as we discovered nuclear power, the amount of energy in the universe increased. So think about it. Did the amount of energy in the universe increase when we discovered how to use uranium and thorium and helium-3? Was the energy already there and we just found it? Or did we create it? Does it make sense to think about it outside of our ability to use it? Because that uranium's not going to do anything on its own just sitting in the ground. It just sits there being a rock, being slightly warm. It has a very slow rate of radioactivity, goes warm. We put it in a power plant, and then we've got energy that we can use to run a factory. Okay, so the other thing that this is a silly thing from a book from 1972 called The Limits to Growth. So these guys at MIT said they discovered how to use a computer. And they discovered that human economy can be measured by a computer in 1972. Now, looking back, we might say trying to understand anything with a computer from 1972 sounds, especially something as complicated as the human economy, people would try to make fun of that. But these guys, they got it. They measured out all these things, like resources, food, pollution, industrial output, population, and they said that, shortly after 2000, we were going to reach a peak, and then the population was going to plummet, mankind was over, we were doomed, there was nothing that could be done about this, we were going to collapse. Now, what was their solution to that?
Reduce the population.
Yeah, reduce the population. So they're not saying they can actually change any of this, they're just saying let's push this back a little bit longer, so we've got 50 more years to have fun in before the whole human race goes extinct. That's not a solution, is it? Yeah. So the obvious, if these guys actually looked seriously at what the book they had written, they would have said, oh, this means we better build nuclear power plants. This means we ought to invest a lot of money on developing fusion so we can create the higher power of nuclear power. Wow, that's what this means. We should be investing and developing. Not at all. They said we should die now. That was their outlook. They said we should reduce the population. So LaRouche says, you know what? There's something that's right about this book. It's not what those guys said. The thing that's right about it is that if you stop developing, yeah, that will happen to you. The lesson is don't stop growing. In fact, a culture that isn't committed in general to growth and development is a culture that isn't fit to exist. And that's not just a moral and judgmental statement. That's just how the universe is. If we don't develop, we're going to die. And it's a culture that isn't really being human anyway. And if the culture is just about doing the same thing every generation and enjoying yourself, where's the humanity in that? I mean, we shouldn't be miserable, but you gotta have a mission besides just going to parties. So on economic value, I put up this quote here. I thought it was very good. LaRouche talks more about how economic value can be measured, and he comes to what the basis of it is. He says, the economy of labor in the productive process must be comprehended as the greatest of all scientific experiments. The experiment which proves empirically, as nothing else can, those principles of scientific discovery upon which the authority of all scientific knowledge entirely depends. Does anybody know the nickname for economics?
Dismal science.
Yeah, some people call it the dismal science. You're Adam Smith, that's pretty dismal. LaRouche is saying economic science is actually the highest science, because it's the science of how the human race functions. There's no higher science than that. That's way beyond studying butterflies, studying rocks, studying life even. This is the highest of them, because you're studying the most profound process that exists, one that mirrors the universe as a whole, us, what we do, how we develop. So when people get into, sort of coffee shop discussions at a university about whether we know anything, what is knowledge, is it all an illusion, are we in the matrix, that's the sort of thing that Descartes liked to think about. Do we really exist? Say, well, you know what? The best proof about whether we know something or not is, have we used it to improve ourselves? Is this theory about physics or whatever, is it right? Well, did it let us do something? Is this theory of electromagnetism right? You can do experiments, that works. But the fact that it lets you make electric motors and improve how we live, you're not going to find a better proof than that this theory is, there's something there. That science itself, the proof of science itself is that we are able to change the way the human species works. And he ends the chapter by saying that now we're going to get into the secret of economic value, which is the principles of scientific discovery. Now, I don't think most economists feel that they really ought to know how science works in order to be an economist. It's its own discipline, right? In fact, it's often not in the same department at the university. So you got the sciences are in this building, and then things like anthropology, and educational theory, and economy, they're going to be over here. Economy really is part of, well, really it's part of both. It's part of science, it's part of culture. But the basis of creation of economic value is the creation of new ideas in the mind. How does that work? Well, LaRouche distinguishes between a few different types of thinking. He gives three kinds of hypotheses, he calls them. These aren't three, but the three levels of hypothesis, he says, first there's the simple hypothesis. That's where you're just sort of thinking to yourself. You say, I wonder if this would, if this would work. I think I was thinking about trying this, would that work? And you just think in your own mind based on what you already know. You sort of think, well, based on what I assume, would this work or not? That's a simple hypothesis. We do that all the time when we're just thinking about things we might do. The next stage LaRouche gives is a higher hypothesis. That's when, instead of a specific thought or idea, you're actually talking about your assumptions. That's the basis of what you're looking at. So, for example, when Kepler discovered how the planets move around the sun, well, and that they move around the sun, and proved it in a way Copernicus never did. When Kepler did that, he didn't just give a formula for a planet. He didn't just say planets move in an ellipse, and they sweep out equal areas in equal time. And then the third law is a mathematical thing about the sizes of their orbits and their speeds. He didn't do that. The first thing he had to do was prove that you could never figure it out with math. Astronomers before Kepler, they were mathematicians. They said, hey, am I doing my job right? There's one way to check if I'm doing my job right. Here's a table of where the planets that they're going to be. Look in the sky. Were they there? If they were there, then I did my job. If you ask them, well, were you right? Like, do the planets move around the sun, or do they move around the Earth? They had their thoughts on it, but overall, it sort of wasn't part of the field. It wasn't part of the study, because people figure out, how would you prove that anyway? All you've got are where you see the planets against the stars. How would you prove what's going on out there when all you get is, where do you see them? So Kepler had to first prove that anybody trying to answer that question with math, it would never work. So he did that. Just like when Socrates tears apart what somebody's thinking, it makes them realize they got to think a little bit harder. So Kepler made a higher hypothesis. He said, we're going to be a physical astronomy. The reason the planets move around the sun is because the sun's making them move. It's not just a couch potato in the middle and they happen to go around it and it got a good seat. The sun's the reason that they move. You were talking about gravitation. You talked about the magnetic power of the sun. His physical ideas weren't all right. But looking back, we'd say, well, this wasn't really, wouldn't agree with that today. But that approach was a higher hypothesis. That we're going to apply physics to those things out there, just like we would look at things here. Okay. And then that third level of hypothesis that LaRouche gives is when you're thinking about how discovery works. How does the discovery process function? He calls that hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. That is, you're making a hypothesis about how higher hypotheses are made. So Riemann's habilitation dissertation is an example of that. A theory of the creation of new knowledge. Studying how are new ideas created. That's the highest kind of study there. And economics takes that up. So creating a truly new thought, that's a tough thing. That's a big thing. That's not something that we generally do every day. Sometimes you have those really fun days where you realize, wow, I thought this and I was totally wrong. Now I see something. I really got something. We experience that every so often. Not every hour usually, but it happens. So in terms of training our minds to do that, because there is a coherence between the way our minds work and the way the whole universe works. Studying one helps with the other. So there is something that we can look at. We look at the history of how did scientists discover things, how did science get made? Okay, we can do that. We can look at the history of how did music develop? You know, what discovery did Bach make about how to use different keys? What did Mozart figure out from Haydn about having a whole musical composition as one? The discovery, in either case, the feeling of, I think in both cases, you have a feeling that you discovered something that was sort of already there. For a musician, for a composer, when you're like, you're putting something together and it works, I think it partly feels, you're composing, you're making something, but also that, oh, okay, this is actually right. It almost feels like in some way it was already there. I'm speaking a little bit theoretically, I haven't written any symphonies or anything here, but based on performing music, I think. And then the other aspect of this is that at this point in the book, LaRouche brings up concentration span. Because he knows people reading it are having trouble at this point. I guess he can read people's minds. And he talks about what's the kind of culture that promotes a real concentration span. What do people think of doing with their lives? Do people think about what they're producing with their lives? Do people think about, he talks about the playboy identity. The idea, well, we used to be an industrial country, but now, what do I do in my time off? What am I consuming? What do people see me consuming? He talks about how advertisements changed. That before, advertisement would be about the product. Like an old Ford ad said, the actual text said, buy it because it's a better car. Right? Now, now the cars are, if you get this, you'll be driving around, there'll be women jumping in your car left and right, how will people look at you, etc. It's much less about, and you can think about this in a lot of fields, like clothes, right? And that's like the biggest one, Is it like, this is a sturdy shirt that will, last for years without the seams coming apart, and it's well made and stains come out of it really nicely, or anything? No, it's what are people going to think about how you look, which, that's part of clothes, but even you see it there, big shift. So having a productive outlook lets you actually think about those things. And then versus becoming a consumer, but also your identity being in how other people think about the things that way you present yourself instead of what you're actually doing with yourself. He goes from there to talk about the problem with, I'll leave that one out. He talks about the problem with thinking of the universe in terms of particles. He makes fun of quarks. We did a series of classes on this recently, and the question for the students to get this across was, think about what's going on in Ukraine and give two ways of explaining it. One in terms of all the things bumping into each other. People wanted to join the EU, but then that terrible president didn't support it, and then the Russians got involved, and then there was a thing in the Maidan, and then the police were called in, and then after that the protests got bigger, and then blah, blah, blah. That's one way of explaining it. The other way of explaining it is that there's an attempt to create a third world war and use Ukraine as a trigger point to make that a possibility. Two totally different approaches. Is history driven by the things bumping into each other? Was World War I really started because some archduke was killed? Or is there a bigger process at play? Okay, just a few more points here. Chapter 7 in LaRouche's book is about money. So this is an economics textbook, and he's finally talking about money in chapter 7. He says that most of what passes for economics is just monetary theory. And in university, it's just all about money. Like we were saying before, the value of something is how much a final sale is on eBay. So LaRouche makes the point here, he said, look, it's mostly propaganda. When people are writing about this stuff about economic theory, they're either trying to explain everything in terms of money, and that gets them all jumbled up, or they're trying to defend usury, and they're just making up theories to defend usury, like what's going on right now with Argentina. So he lays out how money ought to be used, how in the purpose of developing the economy as a whole, the role money plays in it, how you create credit. It's all very straightforward. These aren't hard questions. Monetary theory, he says, it all fits in one chapter. It's actually not that complicated. And he never talks about the law of supply and demand. So, the, based on that, you can then look at how do people, so now, how about an individual person in the economy? How does one person fit in? There's some things you have to look at. Like, for example, how many working years does a person have in their life? What's the population structure? Are there enough people in the next generations to be able to take care of the people who are retiring in the older generation? If you stop population growth, you're not going to have that, which is part of what we're seeing now. Also, he gives the great analogy of looking at an individual person, like looking at an individual improvement in a tool, in a production process. He says, let's say you got some sort of machine tool, some sort of machinery here, and you're going to replace one part of it with a laser. So maybe it's like an automated milling machine or something. And you're going to replace the drill head with a laser. The rest of the machine you didn't change at all. You changed that one thing. And now it works better and faster and the parts are more precise or something. He says every part of that machine just became more valuable. Right? The motors that position the thing to get cut, they're more valuable because they're part of something that's more productive overall. The power cord that plugs into the wall, that power cord is more valuable now because it's part of this machinery that incorporates this laser and makes better parts quicker. The doors, to keep the metal scraps from flying out. I guess it might not be a problem with the laser. Anyway, the whole thing changes. And he said it's just like that with people. Not every person has to be directly involved with forefront projects to still be a part of that. So he gives examples from the past. He says, let's say that, he says like during the Apollo program, when we're going to the moon, not everybody in the US is working on the moon program. He says, take for example, a farmer, a dairy farmer. Okay, they're making milk. They didn't change, they're not using, NASA technology to milk the cow, right? There's no, it's nothing different. It's just milking the cow. And then that milk, who's drinking the milk? Well, how about people who are working on the Apollo program? How about people who are working on new kinds of medical technologies? So and that, just as being a part of the economy as a whole. The farmer, even if they don't know exactly who's buying milk in the store, they know that they're part of a society that's going somewhere, even if they didn't change what they did. People will change what they do, but even if you don't, it still changes. The other example LaRouche gives is, he says, an auto mechanic. Two cars come in. Mechanic does the same job on both cars. One's owned by a pimp, one's owned by a productive worker. What's the value of those oil changes? It might have been negative for the pimp. Maybe it would have been better if his car broke down. All right. The other guy, the value of what the auto mechanic did, they can think, well, what kind of people are bringing their cars in? What's everybody doing? I'm helping. So all of us, Lynn says, all and each among us is a person of universal importance. And it's true. Not only because our lives are part of that whole thing. No one has like your own, we have our own lives, but no one, unless you actually do live on an island by yourself, which I don't think is anybody here, you're part of a society. So when we change where that's going, we're changing everybody's lives, even people who maybe their job doesn't change immediately. And we've all got a responsibility to think of ourselves in those terms. Maybe somebody thinks, well, I'm a good person, I'm doing a good thing. No, I guess it's better than some other jobs, but there's no out. You live in a context. So this is the chart I was talking about before. Lynn writes a chapter about infrastructure where he says the biggest factor, he says if you want to, if you do economic studies, the biggest factor you're going to see is the relationship between infrastructure and economic productivity. You invest in infrastructure, that's the best indicator you're going to have that the economy is going to be growing. Now this uses GDP, which I know I made fun of, but I'm not sure what else to use. So here we've got over here we've got energy use, watts per capita. And this cuts off at a certain point here. And then here's, the GDP per capita. I think this is pretty clear. This is not like, a difficult to interpret image here. For one thing, if you don't have electricity, you're poor. Shouldn't be a surprise. So think about what we're being told about this now.
Excuse me, that blind population,
This is, it's money per capita, GDP per capita.
okay.
Which, yeah, it's money, but it's basically measure how well are people living. I guess a good thing would have been lifespan. I tried doing it with life expectancy, but there's a lot of countries that are up in the upper range of life expectancy, so it just sort of is like, and then it plummets. It still makes a point, but this is.
All right, so that begin at 10,000?
Yeah, so at $10,000, so this is like if each person made $10,000 a year, each person made 60,000. So like in a country where people are using 1,000 watts per capita, they're making around $42,000. GDP is like $42,000 a year per person. In a country with 50 watts per capita, it's like 5,000.
What's the United States?
We're actually off the chart. Our electric, well, we're off this chart. There's somewhere that are off farther to the right. Let me look. I wish I knew this off the top of my head. Our electricity use is, well, right now we use 10,000 watts per capita. I think 40% of that, 30% of that's electric. We're right around here. So, I left off. There's a few more countries that got left off. So, in the world, in fact, I can show this.
But most countries fit on the track that you're showing now?
Pardon me?
Do most countries fit on the track that you're showing now?
Yeah, there's only
The
like 10 that are
industrialized
missing.
So the industrialized countries are off the chart, US, Japan, UK.
I think actually, Australia, the US, I forget exactly now.
But it's only a handful.
It's only a handful that are off of it, yeah. This is a chart of, if you can see this is a chart of the amount of energy use per capita in the US over our history. It shows both that it's increasing and that what we're using changed. Wood, coal, now it exploded, and then oil, natural gas. This tiny red bar here is nuclear power. How small that is. And this is an idea of, this is where in the John F. Kennedy administration, this is where they expected us to be at this time. 50% more. So, a greenie might say, well, we can just conserve energy. You shouldn't waste energy. You shouldn't open all your windows and turn the air conditioner on, in the middle of summer if you don't have a good reason to. But that doesn't mean that you're going to improve society. The whole point about this increase over time in the U.S. and between different countries isn't just using more energy to use more energy. Remember the earlier thing of energy flux density. What kind of energy is it? What are you able to do with it? If we only were using wood, you can't make you're not going to run a train on wood. You're going to run a train on coal. You're not going to run an airplane with coal, right? You need gas for that. So, there are higher levels there. You're not going to run a laser with a steam engine without the technology of electricity, right? You're not going to have horses, pulling on a thing that ends up, creating a laser beam or something. You need electricity for that, just a higher level. So, I just wanted to end with a few things about physical chemistry, to put that in the context, because this 4-point program, LaRouche put here, the 4 new laws to save the USA now, not an option, an immediate necessity. He talks about these four aspects of this here, that we need to, we need to oust Obama, we need Glass-Steagall, we need a national banking system, we need to create credit, invest, and we need to invest in new technologies. At the end, he says, chemistry, the yardstick of history, is the last short section here. I'm going to say a few things that are in this report, the continuing gifts of Prometheus. Think about physical chemistry. Just to look at a few different jumps here. The initial use of chemistry was Prometheus giving mankind fire. That's the story, right? So Prometheus, and here's Prometheus chained to a rock, Zeus's eagle is eating out his liver. This happens every day as punishment. Because Prometheus took fire from Zeus and gave it to mankind. And Zeus was not happy about that. Zeus was actually planning to eliminate the human race altogether because he didn't like us very much. And instead, Prometheus gave mankind this power of fire. And science and poetry and number. He says a whole lot of things that he gave us. But this initial power of fire to do even the simplest things like cooking your food, to not get diseases, and then it can last longer. It won't go bad as quick. Then you look at these just very broad shifts in our ability to control the world around us. Metallurgy. Metal comes from rocks. You know what rust looks like, this red and crufty stuff. It doesn't look very metallic. Imagine a rock made out of rust. What are you going to do with that? Without the high energies of charcoal, and then also the chemical makeup of it, you can't turn rocks into metal. So we've got things that exist now that never existed before on the Earth. Pure iron exists. There's little specks of pure iron you can find on the Earth. Or, it falls from meteorites. Almost none of it. Not now. But we created aluminum. There has never been pure aluminum on this planet. Maybe when it was first formed or something, but there's no pure aluminum anywhere in the Earth's crust. We create it. So we create things that never existed before, just like life did create things that couldn't exist without life. The development of chemistry itself totally changed so much of what we do. I don't want to say too much about that. Or actually, these others are, it's kind of getting long, so I think I should wrap up. The use of electromagnetism. That was a huge discovery that changed chemistry. For example, making aluminum. That uses a lot of electricity. It's possible to make it with chemical processes, but it was so hard to make aluminum that the story goes that Napoleon had he ate off of an aluminum plate because it was so expensive and fancy, while his guests ate off of gold. The cap of the Washington Monument was made out of aluminum, which was an exotic, like, whoa, that was an expensive thing to put on the cap of the monument back then. Now, we have aluminum cans all over the place. Couldn't do it without electromagnetism. Also, think about the ability to transport work, to transport power. Leibniz, back before 1700, wanted to transmit power from a water wheel somewhere else through tubes of compressed air as a way of powering things long distance. They couldn't make tubes well enough back then. You couldn't do anything with it. But now we're able to, instead of carrying around coal to all the factories that need it, you have a wire that goes to it. Big breakthrough. Electric motors, huge breakthrough. Totally changed what we're able to make. And then, I think we know a lot about the things that can do. And then nuclear. Going even smaller, going beyond the scale of the atom, chemistry into what an atom does, how they behave with each other. Huge amount of power that we can get from nuclear technologies. And we've just scratched the surface of this. It's like if electricity was invented and all we ever used it for was light bulbs. That's what it's like with nuclear power. We've just barely touched it. I'll show you a chart of this. This is it might be hard to see. These are all the different kinds of isotopes, chemical isotopes that exist that we measured. The ones, you can maybe look at this later, come up later, it's hard to see. But there's these small black squares in the middle and a few dark red ones. Those are the only ones that actually exist on the Earth on their own. The other colored ones are all ones that we've made. Some of them last long enough to do things with, like medical technologies. Some of them last a million for the second. But we just scratched the surface on that. And so that's where we ought to be going. We need to develop fusion power. The only reason we don't have fusion right now is that it was killed. Deliberate policy to not get that science breakthrough, to hold mankind back, to ensure that poverty would continue to exist. And that's not something we can tolerate anymore. So on these stages, with the ouster of Obama, it then becomes possible to adopt again the mission of improving mankind and of having a sane economics that's based on having that as the goal instead of maintaining a monetary empire through theories that are made up to justify it. fine with that, and let's see if there's questions and thoughts. Okay.
I'm having a time with Prometheus, right? This is Greek mythology, am I correct?
Right.
How could a Greek mythology person, because it wasn't a real person, give us fire?
It's
Well,
a metaphor.
it is I mean, it's, I think there's a certain truth to it that's not that, I don't think he actually went into heaven and took fire and all of that kind of thing. But the reality of it is that at some point that had to be discovered. That's one thing. Like, knowledge is something that was, that sort of defined us as a human species. Like, if you archaeology say, there's fire, that means that was humans, because animals don't use fire. But I think the thing that's real in it is this fight between Prometheus and Zeus. Whether that was like the name of, a specific person, or whether Zeus actually like threw thunderbolts, I don't, that's obviously not true. But that idea of Zeus as being the emperor. In other words, if you look at the parallel between that and then the British Empire, it says the same sort of thing. We don't want a lot of people, we certainly don't want them having any technologies, and they better not think of themselves as being able to know things and challenge us and have our kinds of technologies. Think about a colonial policy, for example. Keep a country poor, keep it backwards, don't let the natives get into technology, etc. It's that same sort of fight. So that's what LaRouche identified about it, is that he said, if you want to really put the British Empire in history, look at it in terms of, go back to Prometheus and Zeus. That's sort of like, that conflict as it's expressed there is like a really good way of just saying that's what empire does. Minus the thunderbolts.
Is Zeus the Roman Empire?
Let me just say one thing.
It was before that, but Zeus was the Roman Empire.
Bruce?
I mean, it was the same. Huh?
I just wanted to say, back in the 70s, LaRouche wrote a paper which cited this Greek historian named Herodotus. Herodotus? Herodotus. And he was writing in that time, back then, that these so-called families of Olympus were actually some kind of oligarchical family at one time, who actually had been dominating the whole Mediterranean. And they later became mythologized as the gods of Olympus, but they were some kind of oligarchical family. And that's where the Zeus comes out, and then Prometheus was one of the people who fought against them and helped to spread culture and civilization. Anyway, that goes back to this guy Herodotus. So there is some kind of historical reference. So it's not just a myth, but it may be, we don't know the exact nature of it, but it was based on certain historical developments.
Yes, that was the first question. I'm still grappling with that, but still, the second one was, a time ago we came here and they said that we have to go beyond the 5 senses.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything on the horizon where we can go toward that?
Yeah. Well, there's a technique that we've got that's like I'll tell you, like Leibniz, for example, sort of like when Lynn was a young man, when Leibniz was like 14, he was reading his father's library, and he realized he did not like Aristotle. Because Aristotle had said that everything we discover comes from the senses, that our mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa, blank slate in Latin, but anyway, we didn't write it. Anyway, that, we got this empty thing, and that we just, whatever comes our way, that sort of makes up our thoughts. Leibniz would say, well, that's obviously not true, because there's some things like take for example the idea of equality. You never find two things that are equal. I mean, we're tempted to today, like all these chairs obviously look very similar, but let's go back before factories and all of that, and none of them are even identical anyway. You never see two things that are equal, so completely equal. Like the thought of, oh, these things are similar in this way, this concept of equality itself, that's something that's obviously already in the mind. So I think what Leibniz did with bringing physics beyond speed and size, which is what Descartes had, to look at that he called the living force of things that was measured by that speed squared, that's definitely something you can only think about. There's no intuitive idea of squaring speed, for example. And the other thing would be Kepler, where instead of just the one sense of vision is all you really got with astronomy, you can't hear a planet or anything. But people before said, are my senses matching my theory? And Kepler said, no, no, what's the why? You know, you can't see gravity, you can't see a magnetic power in the sun. We don't have senses for magnetism, like maybe some animals do. So it's, you know, you're looking at what are those physical things that cause things to occur, as opposed to saying, here's a formula that describes what I see. You're saying, why do those laws exist? What's making it happen? I think it's an approach. And there are specific things we do now that sure don't use our senses. Like, you know, you can't see a magnet, but we can with instruments that then make it something we can see on a screen, for example. That you get both ways.
Everybody's gifted some way. LaRouche was gifted when he was, what, 6 years old or something. He found out he had more than 6 senses. Look at today. We're becoming more myopic, and China and Russia becoming more farsighted. That's why China has that interest of expanding their infrastructure, and they plan to help with, in South Africa, extend the Eurasian land bridge and all these other things. They see production, productivity in expanding and sharing, because they can reap the harvest later. They can't see it, you know, like the British is more like Zeus now, because they're not Cronus, but you know, they're looking inwardly to destroy, you know, rather than to expand.
Yeah, is your power over nature or over
Yes,
other people?
That's it. So that's why these other countries are beginning to see it. They say, now we want to expand ourselves. We want to share, because this way you share with one another. You know.
What was you had a question before? It was like referenced on this slide or this one. You remember
No,
what
it
it was?
was just a comment that certain tools, like earlier errors in the United States, they were made so well that they still work better than some tools nowadays.
Oh.
Well, of course, I'm against the Queen's desire to reduce the world's population. But shouldn't the world's population be checked to a certain extent? Because if we allow the world's population to multiply to, let's say, 1 trillion or more, the world would be so crowded that you wouldn't be able to move about. You'd have a person
let's
saying,
cross that bridge when we get to it.
unless you could get people to live on other planets.
Let's do it and find out.
That's
Yeah.
no, that's just what population has to be checked to a certain extent, but not to diminish it the way the Queen of England.
Yeah, the level, I mean, the level where we're actually physically getting crowded, even with like 40-story buildings, is way beyond, 7 billion, so.
Get to mathematics.
There's plenty empty space on this planet, that's for sure.
True that.
Yeah.
Some of us, a few of us are here that were down and made the trip and did the work this past Wednesday. And what I find very useful about this to really not being full-time and fully able to concentrate on the things you're going through that Lynn's been saying for years. I have a book, for example, but when was the last time I really looked at it? This is very useful because I realize how much stronger it makes me to then go down and deal with what had to be confronted in DC. And we ran into each other or passed each other, our groups, numerous times. And at one point, I asked Bruce, well, what was he finding more of, stupidity or cowardice? And he said both. and that was true. But what was interesting is that, I don't know if it was me or in my trips down, but I got a sense that it was the group overall, that because you can't say on the surface that it was any more successful there weren't people really receptive. I mean, forget this stuff, right? I had an aide of the sitting congressman say to me, well, actually, the president can go to war without congressional approval. Congress has the power to stop funding, right? Now, and so, you know, you say, okay, that's one thing from Joe Blow on the street, right? So-called average American.
Right.
But you really are taken aback. And my thing to her was, look, see, that's the problem right there, right? When you have, because she's probably like in her early 30s. I said, you have 14 years of unitary executive action, and here you are representing a sitting member in Congress, and you're actually repeating that drill. Says, no wonder you don't recognize any threat to thermonuclear war, because you're not really. So I find this useful to help me then to be more serious and more knowledgeable, because after my third or fourth trip or whatever, the fear is gone. These truly are, and you have to go through a process where you say they're not above me, they're not special, and actually they really need my help. So these types of things, and then going back to the studies, really help that, where they could appear to be not related, but actually they are, so that then you can go down there and confront them. And again, my sense was that among our group, and we never really rallied together, but so I don't know if I'm just projecting, but that the focus was there, and it was kind of, damn the torpedoes, you're not going to change the subject, it's time you confront this. And so I'm going to do my best to make it, I think we got something going on at some point before they scurry off, and try and do it one more time, and even see if some of the folks I know here that are in the Bronx, if we can set up some appointments with the congressman, because they really won't see you without that. That's been stated on the calls and so on, and there's no doubt about that. And the final thing was that at the end of the day, we're sitting in the cafeteria, and I said this on the call Thursday night, a sloth-like creature came into the room, kind of reminding you kind of a Jabba the Hutt, and it was Naylor, the congressman, and that's how he walks, that's how he carries himself. And he sat at the table right by our group, we're about 10 of us there. And what did he go there to do, right? To eat. He's there to eat. And he's eating, and then Suzanne approached, spotted him, and went to give him some lip, which, you know, when you go to an animal while feeding, that can be dangerous to get too close. And he took the lip and he kind of, please go away from me, but kept eating though. Got up from the table, left, only to come back with another sandwich. And then eventually again, kind of, after being weighed down a bit, and kind of slothed his way out. So I don't think he would get any of this stuff. See? We just have to call him the liar that we know him to be, because that's what he did with Robert at a town meeting. Said he would support Glass-Steagall, and then obviously has not done that. So why even try and educate a guy like that? You can only make them uncomfortable and squirm.
Yeah. No, not everybody's an optimal target. But I mean, in general, it's like, it's true. You don't always use everything that you. I mean, it's not like I wasn't going through all this at the table yesterday, for example. But just when you have it in your mind, and then it shapes the way you approach. You maybe just say this is a little thing about with somebody about physical economy instead of money. That's an easy point to get across to people. So it's you sort of like you build up this stuff, and then it makes it a lot easier to stay focused with things, because you got a basis that where you're confident.
Shows you what a slave Naylor is to the senses.
Well, I guess you know where to find him if you want to see him again.
Diane wanted me to point out that
There's a little footnote to this, because we met with, our group met with, we were able to set up an appointment with his Washington director, which in itself was, we never expected this. What happened was 4 of us visited, 3 of us visited his office on Thursday. the previous week, and we talked to a scheduler there who's based in New York, and then I emailed the scheduler for an appointment in Washington, thinking that she's the Washington scheduler, but she was, maybe she handles Washington too, but she was in New York. She's a staff person in New York. And then I called her back because Lynn Speed said, oh, you gotta go to the Washington office and get an appointment in the Washington office. So I called the person in New York back, and I said, you know, I think I made a mistake. You're not the Washington scheduler, but could you give me the number of the email of the Washington scheduler so we could maybe get a meeting to follow up the meeting we had in the district, in his district. And she said, well, I've already sent it there to the Washington scheduler. So then, the next day, Tuesday, following Tuesday, I get a phone call from the Washington scheduler who said to me, do you still want a meeting on when you come down on Wednesday? And she said, and I said, yeah, I do. You know, very surprised that this scheduler, who many times in the past has been contacted directly, the one in Washington, and never gave us a meeting. So then she said, you know, the meeting has to be at 4 o'clock. I said, that's fine, we'll be there. And then the person that showed up was the director of the Washington office. Then, after we talked to him, we gave him a full explanation of briefing and so on about everything, including impeachment and the foreign laws and everything. And then afterwards, we had a little debate in the hallway because one person talked a lot about LaRouche, and while he was talking about LaRouche's credibility among China and Russia, and maybe not as much among this particular office, you know, being taking him as an authority, but explaining that LaRouche is an authority in other quarters and he should listen to LaRouche. The person was making faces about that. So we had a little debate, and afterwards, what was the significance of this person meeting with us? Was he there just to listen? Is there some kind of change going on in that office that, you know, was it just something to schedule, or, you know, who knows? But, you know, we have to either not just wait and see, but perhaps there's something going on in that office, perhaps not. Perhaps it was just sounding out. But anyway, that's the matter of.
You don't really know along the way.
Yeah.
Well,
So we'll follow up with this person perhaps, and maybe see if his faces, you know, maybe his faces will stop making faces when he hears the name LaRouche, and maybe he'll also want to listen to what we're trying to say.
They're gonna be back around campaigning over the weekend. So Diane was stressing that we look for where they are going to be over the next few days.
Are they going to be back?
They're bouncing around the districts over the weekend because it's campaign coming up.
Oh.
well, I mean, you know, Robert has been working on Nadler for a while, but that can't be considered an accident. What it really means is difficult to interpret, but just like the 600,000 signatures and Boehner's freak out and the pressure on, this is just another example, I would say, that's what we could report, that they're feeling the heat. What they're going to do about it is another thing, but it's like they won't go away. We're getting pressure from institutional and other forces and other Democrats, so you can no longer not meet with them.
Right.
And so I think that's the context in which to look at it, and perhaps the most substantial one that we could draw from, because I didn't get anything like that from the meetings I had. But again, what's really going on, we don't know. We just know it is getting hot down there for them.
Things are getting hot on the radio too, in WMCA, and I listen to all the stations, George Norrie, Red Eye, Ground Zero, and they're kind of convoluted. But I was surprised, 970, I was George Norrie, they gave a telephone number. And the telephone number is for impeachment of Obama. Now this is strange, because, you know, you hear this from LaRouche and maybe some other splinter groups, but this one, they gave the telephone number. And it's 1-800-522-5240. And you call that number, and they want to raise 1 million signatures, you know, and for the impeachment of Obama. Then this is interesting, because this is from another network. Now, I know how WMCA works. I mean, I like to listen to other stations, they have nutrition, they got a lot of religious programs, but they try to control, you know, without, well, in a certain way. They keep religion under control. So but they work on conditional. Their interest is not exactly like LaRouche's interest, you know. Theirs very conditional. So Obama's a nice guy, as long as they go along with their agenda, and as long as Netanyahu is not, you know, infuriated, then otherwise he's against Obama. Obama's up and down, up and down, up and down, but it's the way that he handles in the Far East and Israel and all that. So I know there's a touchy situation over there, but they're not interested in Glass-Steagall or anything like that. But it's amazing though, because they have a big audience. They still have audience. And I don't blame the religious organizations, but sometimes when you get a network like that, they pressure you out if you don't talk right. I know that. In the way they can pressure people in entertainment out, like George Leno, you know. He may say things about Obama, it's a little, not nasty, but just a little bit this way, and you get pressure out, because his ratings were very high, you know. And where do all these people become multi-billionaires in a very short time, you know?
I wanted to know if anybody had any other questions for Jason on the fundamental topic here.
What about Biden's speech, it's not about, was about infrastructure at the governor's conference? Does this signal, because everybody says, well, if you get rid of, if you impeach Obama, then you have to have Biden. But is this like Biden putting himself forward as an alternative to Obama now? Because if anybody, did everybody know, he made an impassioned speech, as it was described, saying Congress is no good, both parties are no good. He said that basically. Biden, he said both parties aren't functioning. It's up to you guys, the governors. Don't chuckle too much, but it's up to you guys, the governors, to show us how to do things in a bipartisan way, especially with regard to infrastructure. And everybody is aware that they barely can pass this highway. They're trying to put together something to keep the highways and bridges under repair, and they're having a hard time.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think this state thing about how to finance it. I was at a think tank in D.C. and the Japanese ambassador was there, and Governor Ed Rendell from Pennsylvania, former governor, was there to talk about high-speed rail. Basically, Japan's export-import bank, I forget, but Japan was willing to finance half the cost of building a maglev connection between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Japan was going to finance half the cost of this. So Ed Rendell is there giving this great, I can't believe how inspiring this guy. I was kind of surprised. Like, he really loves rail. And so he was talking about what we got, how it'll be great, it'll transform everything. Very, very good speech. And then it came to how it was going to be paid for. And what happens is people have given up on, they try to say, well, we can't expect anything from the federal government. So how are we going to do it, assuming that we don't do it the right way? So then they start talking about public-private partnerships, can we sell bonds, why not on a state level, et cetera. And you know, Cody had asked the question, he said, what do you think about doing this through federal credit? And Rendell said, I'd love to do it that way, but I don't think that's going to happen, and so we're pursuing other things. And you know, it's a little bit like having like a bake sale to cure cancer or an AIDS walk or something like that. It's like that's just not the right way to get money for those things, you know? We have a federal government and the credit's got to be there. So just based on what you're saying about you know, with Biden's, I just know that there's
Of course, he didn't
overall-
mention, I don't know if he mentioned finance, he probably did not.
I just know that's in the context of overall, there's a national push for localities to
Yeah.
start building up infrastructure,
Oh.
and basically outside of the federal government doing it. So it's a tough thing because, you know, when these presentations happen, they're totally right about infrastructure, and then it's in the context of, and we have to somehow pay for it ourselves. So it's, yeah, I don't know exactly what he said, but it just seems like it's part of that, you know, kind of, that's the climate.
Ongoing,
climate thing of it.
Not a question, but how the British against Glass-Steagall would say to promote for many years, every nation must break apart, including the United States must have 8 regions, localities, and if it's a no budget economy on the national level and it's forced on regions or even states to handle any repair of roads
Right.
or, right? Then, without Glass-Steagall, the state-wide may say, well, maybe we don't like fracking, but maybe we should do it because that'd be money and that'll cover other things we have to do if
Yeah.
we're holding the bag in the
Plus,
state level.
you can't create credit on a regional level. So, I mean, because that's the big thing, is that, you know, controlling money is like control, we're not sovereign if we don't have control over our monetary system. So federal credit, like Glass-Steagall and national banking and federal credit, that's a form of sovereignty. If you, every time you want to build something, you have to go get a loan from England, then you're not a sovereign nation. You're not really able to make decisions about, hey, this is a project that's worth doing and it's gonna pay for itself in the future, so we're gonna finance it. If the only reason not to do something that physically makes sense is there's not money sitting around to do it, that's a pretty stupid reason not to do something. Just make the money and then do the thing.
Yeah, we
And then
can
it'll
get the
physically
long
pay
printing
for itself.
presses, so why can't we go ahead and do it?
And we are doing it.
But for the bankers, not for.
Exactly, that's the other thing. Well, that might cause inflation. Like, oh, we don't have any inflation right now, I guess these people don't buy groceries, you know? And then, you know, but the money is being, you know, like Dennis Small went through in the webcast last night about the, you know, this chart of quantitative easing, all this money going into the banks, and the amount of money that banks are actually lending.
Yeah.
You know, that money's not going to help some small business get a loan to hire more people and expand what they're doing or anything.
And
like
China's
that.
investing all kinds of.
Yeah, China's
It's
investing.
not inflationary.
But it's, you know, it's a thing, it's a sovereignty thing. The regions, they just have to, or a state has to sell, you know, they're stuck in the monetary system. And they have to say who already has money and will loan it to us to do this. Federal government isn't the same.
Also, you can reinvest the debt too, which is fun. Putin just gave a speech yesterday or something, announcing that they relieved Cuba of a bunch of this debt from way back.
90% of it.
9%, and then the other leftover debt, Cuba's debt, they're investing into Cuba to build all this infrastructure.
Wow. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court said Argentina has
Has to fall in sort of
to
down.
pay the vulture fund 100% of their.
Yeah, because what people don't understand is the fight that Hamilton had in getting the states to understand that hey, you know, we're the federal government, we'll take care of the debts and so forth. You know, you can't just you're not gonna be able to run things on your own. Let us handle it, we all work together on it, but we'll do it that way. We're the federal government, we'll manage everything. And this idea that, they keep talking about with the states doing this, states doing that, we don't have money for this, money for that. If they just went back to Hamilton and took that on, instead of this idea of the wealth of nations.
And states' rights. And that's the big thing Lynn's been hammering on. He's like, look, it's states' rights are just destroying the United States.
Yeah.
You don't have the United States anymore. You got a bunch of states, and instead of one federal national government, you've got the British Empire. You're part of the Commonwealth.
You think that our problem is that the states have too much power?
What's that?
You say that the states have too much power?
No, I'm saying is that the problem is to try to ask the states to do things that the federal government has to be doing. So if you're asking the states to get loans to build your infrastructure, but who are they going to get the money loaned from? Then they've got to beg the banks for loans. whereas the federal government can create credit. The federal government, the states, they gotta balance their budgets every year. Cities, they gotta balance their budgets.
If we had,
The federal government
had
does.
our own bank like it used to be, would that be easier? We got rid of Federal Reserve, would that be easier? I mean, would that help?
Well, we should have
The whole thing has to be flipped over.
The whole, exactly, yeah, the whole thing's got, I mean, that's the thing, once we get Glass-Steagall, these banks they're all gonna go bankrupt. So, I mean, after we pass that, they're gonna be in bankruptcy court, and then we are gonna be reorganizing all of these things.
There should be a law against making counterfeit money.
Don't the states have some power to invest in infrastructure though? Don't they?
Sure they do.
They issue bonds and.
Yeah, they issue bonds. I mean, a company can issue a bond, a state can issue a bond,
And
it's
another,
like getting a loan.
somebody, a bank or something can buy those bonds, or some investor or something like that.
Yeah.
Because from what I remember historically, like when you had the, I'm not saying, of course, that this takes the place of federal
Right.
credit, but when the Erie Canal was built, for example, it wasn't, and those earlier projects, going way back to the early 1800s, when the canal building boom, weren't they, I mean, it was, a lot of that investment came from the state, state arrangements, financial arrangements or whatever. You know,
Yeah.
some was, the federal government obviously facilitated it in terms of, I don't know how much, what the proportion of money and so on that was put in.
Well, the benefit of a national bank is that you can then get, a bank that is a bank, but doesn't make decisions based on making money, but is based on creating overall growth. Because sometimes there's projects there's plenty of things that are invested in that don't turn a profit. And I was talking to a guy yesterday out in the field. He's like, well, government, oh yeah, the guy who said FDR was bad because he made a big government, and big is bad. And I'm like, just give him a simple example, like, okay, well, he's like, well, private enterprise should build all that. And I was like, so private enterprise is gonna build a dam to stop flooding. Like, are they gonna charge people to not have a flood? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's like a project that's good, it makes sense, it saves lives and, and all this, but you can't, obviously there's no profit in it. Should every road be a toll road? No, it's just something that you have and it's not, I mean, the actual part of the economy that makes money isn't roads and a dam and a school or something like that. That's infrastructure, it's part of the platform.
People got sucked into this idea of privatization. It's terrible.
Same thing, they say, well, if we can't get the money there, we'll have to get it here, and
New York State is one of the few states that does have a balanced budget. This state has a balanced budget, New York State. One of the issues in fracking is this, the Halliburton law. For those of you who don't know, once the state gives permission for them to frack, for the company to come in contract and do the fracking, if there's any environmental damage, it's the state's headache. You can't sue the company for compensation. This is part of what's known as the Halliburton law, was put in when Cheney was vice president. He shepherded through the Congress. And most people don't know about the Halliburton laws, especially the congressman. One of the ignorant bastards stood up and said in Congress, well, why is there no lawsuit against these companies if the fracking's a problem? Because you can't sue them. You cannot sue them once they start fracking. You have permission of the state to frack in that state. You cannot get compensation off those companies for environmental damage. This is the Halliburton law. And this is why I'm deadly opposed to fracking. Don't tell me I'm going to make money. Tell me how you're going to drink the water.
Shouldn't be fields to get a water to in the first place. That's what's going to happen.
Well, also,
You
it's
can't,
also-
once it's broken, you can't fix the water. That's it.
Yeah, and plus it's sort of, fracking is
Yeah,
just
booby
it's a
trap.
symptom of not actually developing. I mean, this, going back to this limits to growth book here. This chart they made that isn't true. Running out of resources. No. Why is fracking even being considered? Because it's getting harder to get, easy to get hydrocarbons. So we gotta do this complicated thing, going down and making these explosions and cracking open the rocks and getting all the stuff out. If we could just have a normal well, of course people would do that, because it would be easier and cheaper. So the reason fracking is happening is because it's difficult to find that kind of resources now. So say, well, instead of looking at, does this fracking well make money? Say, does the policy of fracking make sense? Because it's just, the only way to look at it is in the context of this, this overall growth of power per capita in the U.S. and the fact that it's changing what it's based on. I mean, if we had 1,000 more nuclear plants right now, would we be worried about fracking? No, it wouldn't. It just wouldn't be an issue. It just wouldn't be the sort of thing that you like. For example, I mean, in the in the 1800s, people were really worried about running out of forests because people used wood, right? Now, with the development of coal, no, people aren't all that worried about wood being, forests being torn down to be burned anymore. Not in the United States, because we don't really burn a lot of wood for, have a fireplace here and there, but this is not something we do, right? We use coal. So with these resources, if you are developing to a higher level, then you don't actually run out of what you had before, because it just doesn't really make sense anymore. Like petroleum, for example. We're going to look back and feel really silly that we were burning it as long as we were. But it was a good thing when it first got developed. It's more, it's got more energy in it than coal, and it's a fluid. That's real convenient. You can squirt it through fuel lines and all that instead of big chunks of coal. But we make plastics out of petroleum. In the future, it's going to seem as silly as ethanol should right now. So we got food, and you're going to burn it. That's silly. In the future, like, wait, it would almost be like having this plastic chair and saying, let's burn this in our car. You could make something out of that. Why just burn it? So it's a symptom of things. It doesn't actually make money. The opportunity is this phrase, opportunity cost. Economists talk about sometimes. They say when you make a decision, the opportunity cost is what's the value of whatever else you might have done instead. So you say, I did this thing and that was a good thing. Well, that's good, but you could have done better. The could have done better is the opportunity cost. So for fracking, the opportunity cost is we should be building nuclear plants. We should be developing fusion. So even people who try to say it makes money, that's not even true. It doesn't. One well might, but so what? Legalizing and then taxing prostitution might increase the money in the state's tax base, but is that valuable? Is that good for the economy? No. So that's that thing. So it's the money thing. Yeah, instead of you thinking about what's the whole platform that we're operating off of as a species, you start saying, well, how do we get some money? How do we get some money? Let's legalize that and tax this or whatever.
Can you add anything to that announcement that I heard about CIA who went to Germany, he was kicked out, booted out?
Nothing too in particular. That's about all that there is. It's in the context of a huge blowback in Germany in particular. A lot of the NSA reporting, et cetera, has been coming out of Germany. It's in the context of Merkel's phone being spied on this earlier spy being caught, and the CIA station chief in Germany had been completely uncooperative in working out with the German authorities what had happened with all of that, and so Germany had enough and threw him out. The thing is that doesn't happen every day. Generally, we have a pretty good relationship with Germany, and they don't, basically expel, throw out our diplomats and government workers.
And then this thing happens, and you don't see that in the paper.
So, it's an interesting shift. It's it's not the real game changer in all these things has got to come from here. Like take Argentina for example. It is fantastic that Argentina is standing up. It's great the whole OAS is with them. It's excellent that Russia and China, even France is backing up Argentina on that. That's great news.
And Guyana too.
Right? Yeah, Guyana is made that great speech. It's part of the overall OAS meeting and support. The thing is, if we don't change what the U.S. is doing, if we still got a tool of the British Empire in office as president, ability to launch nuclear strikes, and what can become nuclear strikes. It's like, you know, it's this thing with the, in the chapter on infrastructure in this book, Lynn makes this funny point. He talks about, so the chapter opens, he says, infrastructure is great for the economy. Then he goes through how infrastructure has been destroyed, and he talks about the oligarchy. The chapter is mostly about the oligarchy. He says this is such a no-brainer. If this isn't happening, it is intentional. So, you know, if the intent is not, oh, and then I'm sorry, the point I was going to make about it is he talks about what conspiracies are. It's like people see conspiracies taking place, but usually conspiracy theories are one level too low. They're looking at the people who are operating on behalf of the real oligarchy, you know, doing their errands, doing the things like Henry Kissinger or something like that, or George Soros. Where did he get all of his money? Yeah, does he have $1 billion? Sure, he does. He's a billionaire. But how did he get in that position?
Drugs.
Right? You get put in there and say, well, we'd like you to help us. I think we can work this out. And you just remember who you're working for. And then, you know, then they're a tool. So he says the thing that motivates the people up top, he says it's not greed.
Right.
Right, it's not greed. The British Empire is not greedy. They're printing money all the time and giving it to banks. So they want money, they have more money than they know what to do with. What they want is to enforce an idea of what the human species is. Same thing that we're trying to do. I mean, it's a fight about what is the human species. Are we animals that are going to be, someone just going to be better than others? Or is every person potentially someone who can discover something amazing, transform our species, are we made in the image of God or not? So, unfortunately, if you don't defeat the British Empire, these great things, it's what's going to happen with Ukraine? What's going to happen with Iraq? What if 100 Americans are hostages of this ISIS group? What happens if something else explodes in Ukraine? You know, you've got the potential for World War III right there. So we have to win. We got to win from here.